Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty cool story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. So get cozy, enjoy it, and watch it till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there exists a collision so violent, so fundamentally opposed in nature, that it represents one of the most catastrophic events that can befall the Imperium of man. When the green tide of the Orks crashes against the mechanized bastions of the Adeptus Mechanicus, reality itself seems to hold its breath. This is the story of what happens when savage biology meets sacred machine, when crude brutality encounters ancient technology, when the unstoppable force of the greenskin horde descends upon the immovable object of a forge world. Picture, if you will, a world that has been transformed into a cathedral of industry. Not merely a factory, but an entire planet dedicated to the worship of the machine god through the act of creation. Towering spires of blackened steel pierce skies choked with the smoke of 1,000,000 forges. Rivers of molten metal flow through channels carved over millennia. The very air thrums with the vibration of countless machines. A mechanical hymn that never ceases, never falters. This is a forge world, and it is home to billions of souls who know no existence beyond the service of the Omnissiah. Now imagine that same world through the eyes of an orc. They see not sacred machinery, but the biggest, most beautiful pile of scrap they have ever encountered. They see weapons to loot, vehicles to steal, and most importantly, they see a fight worth having. The technological marvels that tech priests spend centuries perfecting are, to the orcs, simply new toys waiting to be taken. And when the orcs decide they want something, they come in numbers that defy comprehension, with a ferocity that knows no equal, and with a singular purpose: to take what they want and smash everything else. The invasion of a forge world by orcs represents a perfect storm of destruction. On one side stands the Adeptus Mechanicus, wielding technology so advanced and ancient that even they barely understand its full capabilities. They field armies of cybernetically enhanced Skitarii warriors, whose bodies have been more machine than flesh since birth. They command titans, god machines that stand as tall as city blocks and carry weapons capable of leveling mountains. Their industrial capacity is so immense that a single forge world can supply entire war zones with the implements of battle. On the other side, crash the orcs, a species that should not exist according to every law of physics and biology, yet thrives through sheer force of will and collective belief. They reproduce through spores, making them nearly impossible to completely eradicate from a world once they gain a foothold. Their technology works not through understood scientific principles, but because they believe it will work, a psychic phenomenon that baffles imperial scholars. They organize themselves through violence, with the strongest rising to lead hordes numbering in the millions, and they love nothing more than a good scrap. What happens when these two forces collide is not merely a battle. It is a fundamental contest between order and chaos, between the sanctity of the machine and the anarchy of organic fury. It is a test of whether precision and planning can overcome raw numbers and savage determination. It is, in many ways, a microcosm of the eternal war that defines the 41st millennium. The stakes of such a conflict extend far beyond the forge world itself. These industrial planets are not merely production facilities. They are the beating hearts of the Imperium's military capacity. A single major forge world might supply weapons and equipment to dozens of nearby sectors. Lose that forge world, and entire subsectors become vulnerable. Space Marine chapters find themselves unable to replace their sacred war gear. Imperial Guard regiments march to war with dwindling ammunition. The ripple effects can destabilize entire regions of space. For the Orks, the conquest of a forge world represents the ultimate prize. The sheer quantity of salvageable technology, the endless supply of weapons and vehicles to loot, the chance to cobble together increasingly impressive war machines from the bones of the Mechanicus's own creations. It feeds into their fundamental nature. An orc who successfully raids a forge world returns to his tribe as a legend, his status elevated, his claim to leadership strengthened by the sheer audacity of the achievement. But this is not a simple story of attack and defense. The invasion of a forge world by orcs creates unique dynamics found nowhere else in the galaxy. The Mechanicus does not fight like the Imperial Guard, with tactics drawn from ancient military doctrines. They wage war with mathematical precision, every move calculated to maximize efficiency. The Skitarii do not know fear or doubt. Their emotional centers either removed or suppressed by years of conditioning and cybernetic modification. They advance in perfect formation, their weapons firing in synchronized volleys that would make even the most disciplined guard regiment envious. Yet for all their precision, the Mechanicus faces an enemy that defies calculation. How do you plan for an opponent whose technology should not work but does? How do you predict the movements of a force that makes decisions based on which option seems like the most fun? The orcs do not follow the standard patterns of warfare. They do not retreat when logic dictates they should. They do not break when facing overwhelming firepower. They fight with a kind of joyous abandon that is utterly foreign to the cold logic of the tech priests. This creates a paradox at the heart of every orc invasion of a forge world. The defenders possess superior technology, better training, and the advantage of fighting on their home ground. They have prepared for this moment, running countless simulations, identifying optimal firing positions, pre-sighting artillery on every approach vector. Their defenses have been refined over centuries, tested and retested until they represent the pinnacle of defensive engineering. And yet, none of that preparation can fully account for the sheer insanity of an orc assault. Consider the psychological dimension of such a conflict. For the Skitarii, there is no psychology in the traditional sense. Fear has been excised from their minds, replaced with unwavering loyalty to the Omnissiah and absolute obedience to their tech priest masters. They do not celebrate victories or mourn defeats. They simply calculate, adjust, and continue their assigned tasks until either the enemy is destroyed or they themselves cease to function. The orcs, by contrast, are having the time of their lives. Every explosion is music to their ears. Every close quarters brawl is a chance to prove their strength. The bigger and more dangerous the fight, the more they enjoy it. While Skitarii warriors methodically eliminate targets according to predetermined priority matrices, orcs are literally laughing as they charge into withering hails of galvanic rifle fire. This fundamental disconnect in motivation creates a bizarre atmosphere on the battlefield, where one side fights with mechanical efficiency and the other with manic glee. The scale of these conflicts defies easy comprehension. Forge worlds are not small outposts or minor installations. They are entire planets that have been industrialized to the point where natural geography no longer exists. The surface is covered in layers of construction, some dating back 10,000 years or more. Manufactorums the size of mountain ranges churn out tanks by the thousand. Refineries process ore brought up from mines that delve deeper than any ocean. The population often numbers in the hundreds of billions, the vast majority of whom have been born into servitude, their entire existence dedicated to a single task in the great machine of production. When orcs invade such a world, they come in comparable numbers. A major greenskin incursion might involve millions of boys, supported by thousands of ramshackle vehicles, dozens of gargants that rival titans in size, and fleets of crude spacecraft that seem held together by nothing more than faith and welding. The invasion is not a surgical strike or a calculated assault. It is a green tide that crashes against the Forge world's defenses like an ocean against a cliff, relentless and overwhelming. In the hours and days that follow the initial landing, both sides will be tested in ways that few other conflicts in the galaxy can match. The Mechanicus will be forced to adapt their rigid tactical doctrines to an enemy that refuses to behave according to predictable patterns. The Orks will face defensive systems so sophisticated and deadly that even their natural toughness may not be enough to survive. Technology will clash with biology, order with chaos, and the fate of entire sectors will hang in the balance. What follows in this exploration is not merely a tactical analysis of how such battles unfold, though we will certainly delve into the specifics of combat doctrine, weapons systems, and strategic considerations. Rather, this is an examination of what it means when two fundamentally opposed philosophies of existence collide with apocalyptic force. We will walk through the burning streets of besieged manufactorums, stand in the shadow of dueling titans and gargants, and witness the terrible beauty of industrial worlds transformed into battlegrounds. From the moment the first Ork ships emerge from the warp at the edge of a Forge World star system, to the final resolution of the conflict, whether that be Imperial victory, Greenskin triumph, or the Pyrrhic stalemate that so often characterizes warfare in the 41st millennium, we will trace every stage of this cosmic catastrophe. We will understand not just what happens, but why it happens, and what it means for the broader struggle for survival that defines human existence in this darkest of futures, the nature of Forge Worlds, cathedrals of the machine. God, to understand what the Orks face when they assault a Forge World, and what the Mechanicus stands to lose when their domains are threatened, we must first comprehend the true nature of these remarkable planets. A Forge World is not simply an industrial center scaled up to planetary proportions. It represents a fundamental reimagining of what a world can be, a total transformation of a planet's purpose, geography, and even its very essence. When the Adeptus Mechanicus claims a world as a Forge World, they begin a process of conversion that can take centuries or even millennia to complete. Every aspect of the planet is bent to a single purpose, the glorification of the machine god through the act of creation. Natural landscapes are systematically replaced with industrial complexes. Forests give way to refineries, mountains are hollowed out to become vast foundries, and rivers are either diverted to cool massive reactors or drained entirely to make room for more construction. The transformation is so complete that scholars visiting an ancient Forge World often find no trace whatsoever of what the planet might have looked like before the Mechanicus arrived. The physical structure of a typical Forge World defies easy description. Imagine standing on the surface and looking in any direction. The horizon is not a natural curve of Earth meeting sky, but rather a jagged silhouette of countless structures, each taller than the last, reaching toward heavens that are themselves obscured by the constant emissions of industry. Smokestacks kilometers high belch clouds of toxic fumes that merge with the planetary atmosphere, creating a permanent haze that filters the light of the local star into a dim, orange glow. The ground beneath your feet is not soil or stone, but rather layers upon layers of construction, some so ancient that the tech priests have forgotten what lies in the deepest levels. These layers tell the story of the Forge World's evolution. The oldest structures, buried far below, might date back to the dark age of technology, constructed with methods and materials that current generations cannot replicate. Above them lie the foundational works of the early Mechanicus, built during the Age of Strife when Mars first sent out its colony fleets. Higher still are the expansions added during the Great Crusade, when the Imperium's need for war material drove unprecedented growth in production capacity. The most recent layers, by which we mean anything constructed in the last few thousand years, sit on top of this archaeological record of industry, their construction techniques representing the gradual degradation of knowledge that has plagued the Mechanicus since the Horus Heresy. The architecture of a Forge World follows principles that have more to do with sacred geometry and machine worship than with human comfort or even basic habitability. Every structure is designed not merely to serve a function, but to honor the Omnissiah through its very existence. Manufactorums are built in shapes that echo the sacred patterns found in ancient standard template constructs. Refineries are adorned with massive gears and pistons that serve no practical purpose beyond their symbolic representation of the eternal cycle of creation and destruction. Even the simplest warehouse is decorated with binary code prayers in High Gothic, their meaning long since lost, but their importance preserved through ritual. The population of a forge world exists in a state that outsiders might find incomprehensible. From birth, the citizens of these worlds are classified, tested, and assigned to roles that will define their entire existence. Those born with certain genetic markers might be selected for transformation into Skitarii, their bodies systematically replaced with cybernetic enhancements until they are more machine than human. Others might join the ranks of the countless menial workers who maintain the endless machines, their lives spent performing a single repetitive task with mechanical precision. The fortunate few who show aptitude for understanding technology might begin the long journey toward becoming tech priests themselves, though even this path involves sacrificing much of their humanity in exchange for closer communion with the machine god. This population numbers in the billions on even modest forge worlds. Major industrial planets like Mars itself or Riza might host hundreds of billions of souls, all working in perfect synchronization to maintain the vast machinery of production. They live in massive hab blocks built into the sides of manufactorums, sleeping in shifts so that the machinery never stops. They breathe air so polluted with industrial toxins that their bodies have adapted over generations, developing resistances that would astound physicians from less toxic worlds. Many have never seen natural sunlight, living their entire lives in the artificial illumination of work lights and forge fires. The industrial capacity of these worlds is almost beyond calculation. A single major forge world might produce enough lasguns in a year to arm millions of Imperial guardsmen. Its tank factories could assemble thousands of Lehman Russ battle tanks, working around the clock in assembly lines that stretch for kilometers. Specialized facilities create the components for spacecraft, for which dozens of forge worlds might contribute different parts to a single vessel. The most sacred forges work on projects that take decades or even centuries to complete, crafting titans with such care and devotion that each god machine becomes a work of art as much as an engine of war. This production follows strict quotas established by ancient pacts between the Mechanicus and the Imperium. Every forge world is obligated to supply specific quantities of war material to particular imperial institutions. The Administratum maintains vast records of these obligations, tracking production down to individual units and imposing severe penalties on forge worlds that fail to meet their quotas. The Mechanicus, for their part, jealously guards their independence, negotiating these obligations with a political acumen that belies their reputation as emotionless machine worshippers. The result is a complex web of interdependence where forge worlds trade favors, share technologies, and compete for prestigious contracts that might elevate their status within the hierarchy of Mars. The defenses of a forge world reflect both its immense value and the Mechanicus's paranoid appreciation for security. The approach to any major industrial planet is guarded by orbital defense platforms, some of which are themselves the size of small moons. These stations mount weapons that can vaporize capital ships with single salvos, their targeting systems so precise they can track individual fighters across millions of kilometers of void. Below them, the planet's surface is ringed with defense lasers capable of reaching into orbit, creating an overlapping field of fire that makes atmospheric insertion a nightmare for any attacking force. On the ground, the defenses are even more formidable. The Skitarii maintain constant patrols, their augmented senses alert to any threat. Automated defense turrets are built into the very fabric of the industrial landscape, hidden among the machinery and programmed to activate at the first sign of intrusion. Servitors, the lobotomized human-machine hybrids that serve as everything from manual labor to mobile weapons platforms, number in the millions and can be quickly redirected to defensive positions when needed. But the ultimate guardians of a forge world are the Titans. These god machines represent the pinnacle of the Mechanicus' military might. Even a modest forge world might host a single Titan legion, comprising anywhere from a dozen to 50 operational war engines. These massive bipedal machines stand between 15 and 55 meters tall depending on their class, with the rare Emperor-class Titans towering even higher. They are housed in special facilities called Titan manufactorums, massive cathedral-like structures where the god machines rest between deployments, attended by armies of tech priests who maintain every system with religious devotion. Each Titan is more than a weapon. It is a relic, a piece of living history that might have walked the battlefields of the Great Crusade 10,000 years ago. The machine spirit inhabiting each god machine has developed personality quirks over millennia of service, forming bonds with the princeps and crew who pilot it. To lose a Titan is not merely a tactical defeat, but a spiritual tragedy, the death of something irreplaceable. And when these machines walk to war, they do so with a majesty that inspires awe even among those who face them. The strategic importance of forge worlds to the Imperium cannot be overstated. In a galaxy where technological knowledge is slowly being lost, where the ability to create new standard template constructs has been absent for 10,000 years, and where even basic maintenance of ancient systems is performed through ritual rather than true understanding, the Forge Worlds represent humanity's last real hope of maintaining technological parity with its enemies. Without them, the Imperial Guard would march to war with primitive weapons. The Space Marines would find themselves unable to replace their sacred war gear. The Navy would watch its fleet slowly dwindle as ships aged beyond repair. This dependence creates a target that enemies of the Imperium find irresistible. Chaos cultists seek to corrupt Forge Worlds and turn their production toward dark purposes. Tyranids see them as concentrations of biomass worth harvesting. The forces of the Dark Mechanicus, the traitor tech priests who sided with Horus during the heresy, actively work to subvert their loyalist counterparts. And the Orks, they see the biggest collection of loot in the galaxy, just waiting to be taken. The Mechanicus knows this. Every tech priest on every Forge World understands that their domain is not just their home, but a strategic asset that must be defended at any cost. They have spent centuries, sometimes millennia, fortifying their planets against every conceivable threat. They have run simulations of countless invasion scenarios, calculated optimal responses to every type of enemy, and prepared contingencies for contingencies. Their defenses are, in theory, impregnable. But theory is one thing. Practice is quite another. And when the Orks come, they bring something that no amount of calculation can fully prepare for. Absolute, unrelenting chaos. The Greenskin Tide, understanding the Ork menace. To comprehend the true horror of an Ork invasion, from the perspective of the Adeptus Mechanicus, we must first understand the fundamental nature of the greenskin species. They are not simply another Xenos threat to be catalogued and countered. They represent something far more disturbing, a species that defies the basic principles upon which the Mechanicus builds its understanding of reality. Where the tech priests see the universe as an ordered machine operating according to comprehensible laws, the Orks embody a kind of weaponized irrationality that challenges those very foundations. The biological nature of Orks is perhaps the first point of divergence from anything the Imperium considers normal. They are not truly animals in the conventional sense, but rather a bizarre hybrid of fungal and animal characteristics that scholars have dubbed fungoid. This means that Orks reproduce not through conventional means, but via the release of spores. Throughout their lives, and especially at the moment of death, Orks shed microscopic spores into the environment. These spores are incredibly resilient, capable of surviving in conditions that would destroy most forms of life, from the frozen wastes of ice worlds to the acidic atmospheres of death worlds. Once established in suitable conditions, These spores begin a life cycle that produces not just more orcs, but an entire ecosystem of related organisms. The first to emerge are usually squigs, small aggressive creatures that serve as both livestock and crude weapons for the greenskins. Following them come the Gretchen, smaller and weaker cousins of the orcs, who serve as laborers and cannon fodder. Only after this support structure is in place do full orcs begin to emerge from their spore cocoons, already possessing basic knowledge and capabilities encoded in their genetic memory. This method of reproduction has profound implications for any attempt to eliminate an orc infestation. Traditional warfare aims to kill enemy combatants and destroy their ability to replenish their numbers. But killing orcs actually makes the problem worse in the long term, as each death releases thousands of spores that will eventually produce new greenskins. The only way to truly cleanse a world of orc contamination is through exterminatus, the total destruction of all life on the planet. Anything short of this leaves the possibility, often the certainty, that orcs will eventually re-emerge. For a Forge world facing orc invasion, this creates a nightmarish scenario. The very battles fought to defend the planet ensure its long-term contamination. Every orc that dies in a manufactorum, every greenskin slain in the depths of a refinery, releases spores that will find purchase in the countless nooks and crannies of the industrial landscape. Years or decades after a successful defense, orc tribes might emerge from forgotten sublevels, forcing the Mechanicus to wage an endless guerrilla war in the bowels of their own world. But the biological peculiarities of orcs are only the beginning of what makes them so dangerous. Their technology, if it can even be called that, operates on principles that seem to mock everything the Mechanicus holds sacred. Orc weapons and vehicles are cobbled together from scrap metal, spare parts, and components that should not work together. An orc rocket might use fuel that would explode on contact with its oxidizer if built by anyone else. Their guns should jam immediately, their vehicles should tear themselves apart from stress, and their spacecraft should never survive a warp jump. And yet, they work. They work because the orcs believe they will work. This is perhaps the single most infuriating aspect of the greenskin species, from the Mechanicus perspective. All orcs possess a low-level psychic ability, a gestalt field that grows stronger as more orcs gather together. When enough greenskins believe something strongly enough, reality bends to accommodate that belief. Red vehicles go faster because orcs think red makes things go fast. Guns never run out of ammunition because orcs do not understand the concept of finite resources. Crude welding holds together because no orc doubts that it will. This psychic phenomenon extends to the larger scale of orc organization, the Great Crusades they call, in their brutal language, a big warpath. When a particularly powerful orc warboss emerges, usually through the simple expedient of being the biggest and strongest greenskin around, he begins to attract followers. As his warband grows, so too does the psychic field generated by his followers. This in turn makes the warboss himself stronger, allowing him to defeat more rivals and attract even more followers. The cycle continues, feeding on itself until millions or even billions of orcs are united under a single leader. At this scale, the psychic energy generated by the great green mass becomes palpable even to non-psychic species. It manifests as a kind of infectious enthusiasm for violence that drives the orcs to ever greater acts of destruction. They become, in a very real sense, a force of nature, unstoppable not through superior tactics or technology, but through sheer momentum and mass. And when such a horde sets its sights on a target, nothing short of annihilation will stop it. The social structure of orc society, if it can be dignified with such a term, is brutally simple. Might makes right. The strongest orc is in charge, period. This leads to constant infighting and challenges for leadership, which might seem like a weakness, but actually serves to keep the species strong. Weak orcs are quickly culled, ensuring that only the most capable fighters survive to lead. The warboss rules through intimidation and violence, with his authority backed by a cadre of nobs, the largest and most battle-scarred of his followers. Beneath this leadership structure exists a complex ecosystem of specialist orcs, each type born with instinctive knowledge of their particular role. Mechs are born understanding how to build and repair technology, even though they could not explain the principles behind their creations. Docs know how to perform crude surgery, often involving the simple expedient of replacing damaged body parts with mechanical equivalents. Weird boys channel the psychic energies of their fellows, often to catastrophic effect. Each of these specialists contributes to the overall capability of the warband, creating a force that is far more dangerous than its crude appearance might suggest. What draws orcs to Forge Worlds specifically is a combination of factors that make these targets irresistible. First, and most obviously, is the sheer quantity of lootable technology.
Can we just talk about how insane it is that orc technology works purely because they believe it will? Like, imagine being a tech priest who spent 300 years mastering plasma reactor theory, and then you see an orc tape a gun to another gun with actual tape, and it just works. I lose my mind. Like, that's got to be the most frustrating thing about fighting orcs. All their logic and science means nothing against weaponized belief. Anyways, back to the story.
To an orc mech, a Forge World represents paradise, an endless supply of components, weapons, and machines just waiting to be liberated and repurposed. The scrap from a single manufactorum could supply a warband for years, allowing them to build ever larger and more destructive weapons. Second is the quality of the fight. Orcs do not seek easy victories. They want challenges, opponents who can give them a proper scrap. The defensive capabilities of a Forge World, with its Skitarii legions and Titan detachments, promise exactly the kind of brutal, grinding combat that orcs live for. The prospect of fighting Titans is particularly appealing, as few orcs ever get the chance to test themselves against such legendary opponents. Third, and perhaps most important, is the matter of reputation. An orc warboss who successfully raids a Forge World gains immense prestige among his kind. The story of such an achievement will be told and retold, growing in the telling until it becomes legend. This attracts more orcs to the successful warboss's banner, strengthening his position and enabling even more ambitious campaigns. In the brutal calculus of orc society, the risk of assaulting a heavily defended Forge World is more than justified by the potential rewards. When orcs organize for a major assault, the preparation phase, if it can be called that, is chaotic and violent. The warboss announces the target, usually chosen based on nothing more sophisticated than it seeming like it would be fun to attack. His nobs begin organizing mobs of boys, which inevitably leads to fighting as different groups argue over who gets to be in the first wave. Mechs are ordered to build more vehicles, weapons, and whatever else the warboss thinks might be useful, leading to a frenzy of construction that produces everything from functional war machines to complete death traps. The orc fleet that eventually assembles is a ramshackle collection of vessels that would give any Imperial Navy officer nightmares. Space hulks, massive agglomerations of fused spacecraft pulled from the warp, serve as capital ships. Smaller orc vessels, built from scrap and given engines that by all rights should not be able to move their bulk, form a supporting fleet. Countless orc fighters, bombers, and dropships fill the void between larger vessels, ready to swarm over any enemy ship that gets too close. When this green tide finally launches itself toward its target, it does so with all the subtlety of an avalanche. There is no careful planning of approach vectors, no sophisticated electronic warfare to mask their arrival. The orcs simply aim their ships at the target and accelerate, confident that their force of will is sufficient to see them through. And terrifyingly often, they are right. The psychological profile of an orc, insofar as such things can be understood, is alien to human thinking in fundamental ways. They do not feel fear in any conventional sense. Pain is not something to be avoided, but rather feedback about how intense the fight has become. Death is not a terror, but simply the end of the fun. This makes them essentially immune to the psychological warfare that works against most species. You cannot break orc morale because they do not have morale in the conventional sense. The worse the battle goes, the more exciting they find it. This mental framework means that orcs approach combat with a kind of joyous abandon that is utterly foreign to the methodical calculations of the Mechanicus. Where a Skitarii warrior analyzes threat levels and prioritizes targets according to predetermined matrices, an orc boy simply charges toward whatever looks like the most fun to fight. Where a tech priest calculates optimal force deployment ratios, an orc war boss decides based on which option would be the most entertaining. This fundamental mismatch in decision-making processes creates a battlefield dynamic that defies standard Imperial tactical doctrine. Perhaps most disturbing from the Mechanicus perspective is the way orcs adapt and learn from their enemies. While individual orcs are not particularly intelligent by human standards, the species as a whole has a kind of collective genius for reverse engineering. An orc mech who gets his hands on Imperial technology will immediately begin pulling it apart to see how it works, and more importantly, how he can make a bigger, louder, more destructive version. The understanding might be crude, and the resulting creation might be hideously dangerous to use, but it will work, powered by the orc's unshakable belief that it should. This creates a particularly vicious cycle when orcs invade a forge world. They start with their own crude technology, but as they loot Mechanicus weapons and vehicles, they begin incorporating superior components into their own arsenal. A mech might attach a Forge World's plasma weaponry to a ramshackle battle wagon, creating something that should explode immediately, but somehow does not. Captured Skitarii weapons find their way into orc hands, where they continue to function despite maintenance that would make a tech priest weep. The longer the battle continues, the more dangerous the orcs become, not through careful planning, but through opportunistic theft. The storm approaches, detection and preparation. The first warning of an impending orc invasion typically comes from the augury stations that ring every Forge World system. These massive sensor arrays, some ancient enough to predate the Imperium itself, constantly scan the void for any sign of threat. They monitor warp disturbances, track the movements of every vessel in nearby space, and maintain communication with the wider Imperial network. When the readings begin to show the characteristic disruptions that herald a major warp emergence, the tech priests manning these stations immediately escalate the alert to the highest levels of the Forge World's hierarchy. The emergence of an orc fleet from the warp is not subtle. Where Imperial vessels transition between real space and the immaterium with practiced precision, emerging at calculated points that minimize disruption, orc ships simply tear their way back into reality with all the grace of a charging grox. The warp storms they leave in their wake can persist for days, disrupting communications and making additional jumps into the system dangerous. This actually works to the orcs' advantage, as it prevents easy Imperial reinforcement and buys them time to establish their invasion. When the augury data confirms the presence of a significant greenskin force, the response on a Forge World is immediate and methodical. The Fabricator Locum, the highest-ranking tech priest on the planet, convenes the conclave of Magi, bringing together the leaders of every major faction within the local Mechanicus hierarchy. These deliberations follow ancient protocols, with each Magos presenting data, running probability calculations, and engaging in binary cant discussions that would be incomprehensible to outsiders. But beneath the ritual and procedure lies a simple question: can the Forge World survive what is coming? The answer to that question depends on numerous factors, each of which must be carefully analyzed. How large is the orc fleet? Augury data can provide estimates, though the Mechanicus knows from bitter experience that orc numbers are notoriously difficult to accurately assess. What is the current readiness status of the Forge World's defensive forces? Skitarii legions might be deployed across multiple star systems, Titan legions might be committed to other theaters, and the planet's fixed defenses might be in various states of repair. Perhaps most critically, how long until reinforcements can arrive? The Mechanicus maintains complex treaties and alliances throughout the Imperium, with provisions for mutual defense in case of attack. An urgent astropathic message goes out immediately, calling for aid from nearby Space Marine chapters, requesting Navy support, and alerting other Forge worlds to the threat. But the warp is uncertain, and messages can take days, weeks, or even months to arrive. The Forge world must assume it will fight alone, at least initially. Once the decision is made to defend, and it almost always is, the Forge world begins its transformation into a fortress. Production quotas are temporarily suspended as manufactorums shift from creating goods for export to producing weapons and ammunition for the coming battle. Vast stockpiles of war materiel, maintained for exactly this contingency, are unsealed and distributed. Every Skitarii warrior on the planet is recalled to active duty, their routine patrols and guard assignments abandoned in favor of combat readiness. The civilian population, those billions of menial workers who maintain the endless machinery of production, are organized into militia formations. This is not done with any real expectation that they will significantly contribute to the defense. Unaugmented humans cannot stand against Ork boys in close combat, and their training is minimal at best. But they can serve other functions, carrying ammunition, evacuating the wounded, and if necessary, dying in sufficient numbers to slow the enemy advance. The Mechanicus is nothing if not pragmatic in its use of resources, and human life is simply another resource to be deployed as efficiently as possible. The Skitarii themselves undergo rapid preparation for combat. These cybernetic warriors exist in a state of constant partial readiness, their bodies maintained by regular servicing and their combat protocols updated frequently. But full battle preparation involves additional steps. Combat drugs are loaded into their systems, chemical cocktails that will enhance their already augmented performance at the cost of long-term health damage. Targeting systems receive final calibration. Weapons are blessed in ceremonies that combine religious devotion with genuine technical maintenance. Different classes of Skitarii prepare in different ways. The Vanguard, radiation-armed infantry designed to advance under the heaviest fire, receive additional doses of rad saturation that will make them walking hazards to any enemy who closes with them. The Rangers, long-range specialists trained to stalk their prey across any terrain, check and recheck their galvanic rifles, knowing that in the coming battle, precision will be essential. Sicarian infiltrators, the stealthy killers of the Mechanicus arsenal, prepare to wage a shadow war in the labyrinthine depths of the Forge world's industrial complex. The vehicle pools are activated, with tanks and walkers that might have sat dormant for months or years, suddenly brought to full operational status. Scorpius Donor Riders, the armored transports that will carry Skitarii into the heart of the battle, receive final checks of their systems. Onaga Dune Crawlers, walking tanks bristling with devastating weaponry, are loaded with ammunition and assigned to defensive positions. The Iron Strider engines, agile walkers mounted with precision weapons, form into hunting packs, ready to exploit any weakness in the enemy advance. But the true guardians of the Forge world are stirring in their cathedral homes. The Titans have received the call to war. In the massive Titan manufactorums, tech priests swarm over the dormant god machines like ants over a fallen giant. Each system must be checked, every weapon blessed, and the machine spirit of each Titan carefully awakened and prepared for battle. This is not a simple mechanical process, but a sacred ritual, for the machine spirits of Titans are temperamental and must be approached with respect and devotion. The princeps who command these god machines undergo their own preparations. These individuals are not normal humans, but rather have been specially trained and augmented to interface with the Titan systems. The neural connection between princeps and Titan is so deep that it borders on the mystical, with the pilot literally feeling the Titan's pain and sharing its rage. As they prepare for battle, princeps enter a kind of focused meditation, communing with their war engines and preparing themselves psychologically for the ordeal ahead. Different classes of Titans prepare according to their roles. The Warhound Scout Titans, the smallest and most agile of the god machines, will range ahead of the main force, hunting for enemy concentrations and providing early warning. The Reaver Battle Titans, workhorse war engines of the Collegia Titanica, form into maniples, working groups that will serve as the backbone of the Titan Legion's battle line. The mighty Warlord Battle Titans, massive engines mounting enough firepower to level city blocks, take up positions at key strategic points, ready to bring their crushing power to bear. In the rare forge worlds that possess them, the Emperor-class Titans are awakened. These colossal machines, so large that they are visible from orbit, are reserved for the most dire circumstances. Their activation is itself a momentous occasion, requiring the attention of the highest-ranking tech priests and consuming enormous amounts of power. But when they walk, reality itself seems to shift, the ground trembling beneath feet that could crush tank companies. The fixed defenses of the Forge world are brought to full readiness. Orbital defense platforms charge their lance batteries, preparing to engage the Ork fleet as it approaches. Surface-to-orbit defense lasers, some powerful enough to threaten capital ships, are elevated and targeted at likely approach vectors. Point defense systems that can shred incoming drop pods and assault craft come online, their targeting cogitators running countless scenarios. Within the Forge world's industrial landscape, defensive positions established over centuries are activated. Hardened bunkers emerge from beneath camouflaged hatches. Automated turrets swing up from hidden bays, their weapons pre-sighted on approaches to critical facilities. Servitor-battle congregations are loaded with combat protocols and moved into position, their numbers so vast that they form living walls of expendable flesh and crude weaponry. The Forge world is transforming, its appearance shifting from industrial center to fortress. The psychological impact of these preparations varies greatly depending on who is experiencing them. For the Skitarii, there is no psychological impact in any meaningful sense. They receive their orders, acknowledge them in binary, and proceed to execute their assigned tasks with mechanical precision. Fear, excitement, anticipation, these are emotions that have been excised from their augmented minds. They simply exist in a state of readiness, awaiting deployment. For the menial workers, the impact is more profound. Most have lived their entire lives knowing nothing but their assigned tasks, working the same machines in the same manufacturums generation after generation. The sudden disruption of this routine, the transformation of their familiar world into a war zone, creates a kind of disoriented terror. But they have been conditioned since birth to obey the tech priests without question, and they do so now, forming into their militia units and taking up positions despite having little understanding of what is about to happen. For the tech priests themselves, the emotional response is complex and often contradictory. On one level, they approach the coming battle with the same analytical detachment they bring to all situations, calculating probabilities and running tactical simulations. But beneath that mechanical exterior, many retain enough humanity to feel genuine concern, not for their own lives necessarily, but for the safety of the sacred machines and ancient knowledge entrusted to their care. The potential loss of irreplaceable technology, the destruction of production capabilities that took millennia to develop, these are losses that cut deep into the Mechanicus soul. The orbital space around the Forge world becomes a hive of activity as every available defensive asset is deployed. Navy ships that were docked for resupply scramble to launch, forming a defensive line between the planet and the approaching Ork fleet. Fighter squadrons launch from surface bases and orbital stations, their pilots knowing they face Overwhelming numbers, but determined to exact as heavy a toll as possible. Mining stations and refineries in the outer system are evacuated if time permits, or simply abandoned if it does not. Communication with the wider Imperium becomes a priority, even as the Forge world prepares its defense. Astropaths, psychic communicators who can send messages across the vast distances of space, are pushed to their limits as they broadcast desperate pleas for aid. Each message is the same. A Forge world is under attack, and if it falls, entire sectors will be left undersupplied. Come quickly, bring everything you can. But the Mechanicus knows that help, if it comes at all, will not arrive in time to stop the initial assault. The warp is too unpredictable, distance is too vast, and the number of enemies the Imperium faces too numerous for rapid reinforcement. The Forge world must survive the first days, perhaps weeks of battle on its own. Everything depends on the preparations they are making now, in these final hours before the Orks descend. As the enemy fleet grows closer, visible now not just on augury screens, but to the naked eye as a massive cloud of vessels blocking out the stars, the Forge world holds its breath. The endless rhythm of industry, that mechanical heartbeat that has pulsed without interruption for millennia, finally falters. Not because the machines have stopped, they will never stop, but because every thinking being on the planet understands that in the next few hours, everything will change. The Orks are coming, and the only question is whether the sacred machines of the Forge world, combined with the cold determination of its defenders, will be enough to stop them. Orbital thunder. The space battle begins. The void between the stars, that infinite cold expanse where normal rules cease to apply, becomes a cauldron of violence as the Ork fleet closes with the Forge world's orbital defenses. This is not like the space battles depicted in ancient texts, where ships duel with grace and precision across vast distances. This is something uglier, more primal, a brutal slugging match where victory goes not to the most skillful, but to the most resilient. The Ork fleet does not employ anything that could be charitably called tactics. Their ships simply accelerate toward the planet, engines blazing at full capacity, weapons firing long before they have any hope of hitting anything. This apparent recklessness serves a psychological purpose, conveying an impression of overwhelming momentum that can break the will of less determined defenders. But the Mechanicus does not break. Their orbital defense platforms, massive structures that have guarded this Forge world for millennia, open fire with mathematical precision. Lance batteries, weapons powerful enough to punch through the heaviest armor, reach across millions of kilometers to strike at the approaching Ork vessels. Each shot represents the culmination of ancient technology, focusing immense energies into beams of coherent light that can vaporize lesser spacecraft. The targeting calculations involved are staggeringly complex, accounting for relative velocities, gravitational distortions, and the time lag inherent in fighting at such ranges. The Mechanicus performs these calculations with ease, their cogitators processing data faster than any human mind could comprehend. The first Ork ships to die do so in spectacular fashion. A lance strike hitting the crude reactor of an Ork cruiser triggers a catastrophic explosion that vaporizes the entire vessel and heavily damages everything nearby. The expanding cloud of debris becomes a hazard to navigation, forcing other Ork ships to adjust their approach. But for every ship destroyed, a dozen more continue their advance, their numbers simply too great for the defense platforms to eliminate before they close to engagement range. As the Ork fleet enters the outer defensive sphere, the nature of the battle changes. Point defense. Systems activate, filling space with curtains of last fire designed to intercept missiles and strike craft. The Orks respond by launching everything they have, crude fighters and bombers streaming from every vessel in a swarm so dense it appears on augury screens as a solid mass. These spacecraft are suicide vessels in the truest sense, many of them barely spaceworthy, and crewed by Orks who understand they will likely not survive the engagement. But they do not need to survive. They only need to overwhelm the defenses through sheer numbers. The fighter screens, launched from the Forge World's orbital stations and surface bases, do their best to stem this tide. Imperial pilots, many of them servitors with their brains hardwired into their craft systems, engage in frantic dogfights with Ork fighters that ignore all conventional aerial combat doctrine. An Ork pilot does not worry about fuel consumption or ammunition management. They simply push their craft to maximum speed and fire until their guns run dry, often ramming enemy fighters when they run out of other options. In this chaos, patterns begin to emerge. The Ork fleet, for all its apparent disorder, is actually organized according to a crude but effective hierarchy. The largest vessels, massive space hulks, and converted cargo haulers form a rough core that advances steadily despite taking horrific damage. Around them, smaller ships serve as escorts, their role not so much to protect the capital ships as to absorb fire that might otherwise hit something important. The smallest craft, countless fighters and assault boats, form a screening swarm that obscures targeting and creates confusion. The Mechanicus responds by prioritizing targets according to threat assessment matrices developed over thousands of years of warfare. The largest Ork vessels must be eliminated first, as they likely carry the bulk of the invasion force. Secondary targets are identified as vessels showing unusual energy signatures, possibly indicating the presence of Ork war bosses or valuable equipment. Only after these priority targets are engaged do the defensive systems turn their attention to the lesser vessels. This methodical approach works against human or even alien opponents who value their assets and will withdraw if losses become too severe. But Orks do not retreat. They do not even slow down. As their ships are systematically destroyed, the survivors simply spread out, filling the gaps left by destroyed vessels and continuing their inexorable advance. The mathematics of the engagement become brutal. The Orks are losing ships at a rate that would devastate any other fleet, but they started with so many that losses which should be crippling merely reduce their numbers to merely overwhelming. Boarding actions begin as Ork assault ships, crude things barely deserving the name spacecraft, attach themselves to orbital defense platforms through the simple expedient of ramming into them. Ork boys pour out of boarding, pods, armed with crude but effective weapons and fueled by the joy of close-quarters combat. The defenders of these platforms, usually a mix of Skitarii and servitors, find themselves engaged in brutal fighting in the cramped corridors of the stations. These boarding actions play to Ork strengths. In the confined spaces of an orbital platform, superior firepower and precision are less important than raw aggression and physical strength. An Ork boy, larger and stronger than an unaugmented human, and equal to or exceeding many forms of light augmentation, can simply overwhelm defenders through brute force. The greenskins clear corridors not through tactical clearing procedures, but by charging straight ahead, soaking up defensive fire through their natural toughness and crashing into enemy positions with devastating impact. Some platforms fall quickly, their defenders overwhelmed before they can organize an effective resistance. Others hold longer, Skitarii forces establishing defensive positions and making the Orks pay dearly for every meter of corridor. But the outcome is often the same. Unless the platform can be relieved by reinforcements, something that becomes increasingly difficult as the battle progresses, it will eventually be lost. The only question is how much damage the defenders can inflict before the end. The fall of orbital defense platforms creates gaps in the defensive net, allowing more Ork ships to slip through toward the planet. The remaining platforms redouble their fire, targeting engines and attempting to disable vessels before they can reach atmosphere. Some Ork ships are crippled by this fire, their momentum carrying them past the planet or sending them tumbling into decaying orbits. But others maintain their trajectory, beginning the violent descent toward the surface. Atmospheric entry for Orkcraft is less a controlled procedure than a barely controlled fall. Their heat shields, such as they are, often fail. Their guidance systems, never particularly sophisticated to begin with, frequently malfunction under the stress of re-entry. Many vessels burn up, or break apart before reaching the surface. But the Orks plan for this, launching far more craft than necessary with the understanding that only a fraction need to survive for the invasion to succeed. From the surface, the sight of thousands of Ork craft entering atmosphere resembles a meteor shower, streaks of fire crossing the sky in every direction. But these meteors carry death. Drop pods designed to penetrate deep into enemy territory slam into industrial districts at terminal velocity, their crude but effective shock absorption systems keeping their Ork passengers alive mostly. Landing craft, larger vessels carrying vehicles and heavier equipment, aim for the outskirts of major population centers, where they can establish beachheads and begin offloading their cargo. The Forge World's surface-to-orbit defenses engage these descending craft with everything they have. Defense lasers track and destroy drop pods, turning them into fireballs that rain debris across kilometers of territory. Point defense systems shred smaller craft, their focused fire precise enough to target individual vessels. But the sheer numbers overwhelm even the most sophisticated defensive network. For every Ork craft destroyed, 3 more make it through, crashing into the surface with impacts that register as seismic events. The landing sites are chaos incarnate. Ork drop pods, never designed for gentle touchdowns, slam into the ground with such force that they frequently bury themselves several meters deep. The boys inside emerge, often injured but always ready to fight, immediately beginning to secure the area around the landing site. Landing craft that survive the descent lower their ramps, and streams of Orks pour out, accompanied by the rumble of crewed vehicles and the bellowing of Ork commanders. These initial landing sites are not chosen according to any sophisticated, strategic plan. The Orks simply drop wherever their nav systems, such as they are, point them. This means landing zones are scattered across the Forge World's surface, from the heart of major industrial centers to the wilderness between population areas. This seemingly random distribution actually works in the Orks' favor, as it prevents the Mechanicus from concentrating their defensive forces and creates confusion about where the main thrust of the attack will come. In space, the battle continues to rage. The Ork fleet has been bloodied, but not broken, and now their ships begin to assume orbital positions, preparing to provide support for the ground assault. Crude bombardment cannons start lobbing shells toward the surface, inaccurate but devastating when they hit. Ork fighters transition from space superiority missions to ground attack runs, strafing defensive positions with their crude but effective weapons. The Mechanicus fleet, what remains of it after the initial engagement, attempts to disrupt these orbital positions. Imperial Navy cruisers, their ranks thinned by the brutal fighting, make attack runs on Ork capital ships, attempting to drive them away from optimal bombardment positions. It is a desperate gambit, trading damage for time, buying the ground forces a few more hours before the full weight of orbital fire support can be brought to bear. But both sides know that the space battle, dramatic as it is, will ultimately be decided on the ground. The Orks cannot hold space without controlling the surface. The Mechanicus cannot protect their planet if the Orks establish an unbreakable foothold. Everything, all the sacrifice and heroism in orbit, serves only to set the stage for the real battle that is about to begin in the industrial canyons and manufactorum districts of the Forge World below. And there, in those labyrinthine passages between towering machinery, in the shadows cast by kilometer-high chimneys, in the depths of production facilities that stretch beneath the surface for hundreds of meters, the true nature of this war will be revealed. Technology will face biology, order will confront chaos, and the sacred machines of the Omnissiah will either stand firm or be drowned beneath a green tide that knows no mercy and accepts no defeat. Ground Zero. First contact and urban warfare. The first Ork to set foot on the surface of the Forge World dies before he has taken 3 steps. A Skitarii ranger, positioned on a high vantage point overlooking one of the predicted landing zones, puts a galvanic servitor bullet through the greenskin's skull with mechanical precision. The death means nothing. Behind that first Ork come hundreds more, then thousands, then tens of thousands, a tide of green flesh and crude metal that no amount of precision shooting can stem. The initial engagements between Ork landing parties and Mechanicus defenders follow patterns that have been repeated across countless worlds. The Skitarii establish kill zones, areas of overlapping fire where their superior weapons and targeting systems can inflict maximum casualties. They hold these positions with the inhuman patience of beings who do not feel fear or doubt, calmly eliminating targets as they appear. For the first few minutes, this works exactly as planned. Then the Orks close to melee range, and everything changes. The greenskins are not deterred by casualties. The sight of their fellows being cut down does not trigger retreat or even caution. Instead, it seems to excite them, driving them into a frenzy that makes them even more dangerous. When the first Ork boy crashes into a Skitarii defensive position, his crude chopper swinging with strength far beyond human capacity, the mathematical certainty of the Mechanicus's defense begins to crumble. Close quarters combat is not the Skitarii's preferred engagement range, but they are far from helpless. Cybernetic enhancements provide strength and speed beyond unaugmented humans. Combat. Protocols hardwired into their neural networks guide their movements, selecting optimal responses to each threat. But the Orks have advantages too. Raw physical power, natural resilience that allows them to shrug off wounds that would kill lesser beings, and an absolute refusal to acknowledge when they should be dead. The battlefield quickly fragments into dozens of smaller engagements, each centered on an Ork landing site. In some locations, the Mechanicus maintains cohesion, their Skitarii formations holding position and systematically eliminating the greenskin invaders. In others, Ork numbers overwhelm the defenders, forcing them back in fighting retreats that preserve the force but surrender ground. And in still other areas, the battle dissolves into chaotic melees, where the carefully planned defensive strategy becomes irrelevant. The terrain of a Forge world creates unique challenges for both sides. This is not open ground where formations can maneuver freely, nor is it a natural environment where terrain features provide obvious cover and concealment. Instead, it is an industrial landscape so dense and complex that visibility rarely extends beyond a few dozen meters. Manufactorums rise like artificial mountains, their sides sheer walls of metal and ceramite. Pipelines carrying everything from coolant to molten metal crisscross the ground at various heights, creating obstacles that must be climbed over or ducked under. The ground itself is often unstable, a patchwork of grating, duracrete, and exposed bedrock. In this environment, the Orks' natural advantages in close combat become even more pronounced. They can use the industrial landscape to close with their enemies, charging from behind massive machines or dropping from overhead pipes. Their crude but effective weapons are well suited to the close ranges, where accuracy matters less than rate of fire and stopping power. A shooter, the basic Ork firearm, is wildly inaccurate beyond a few dozen meters, but in the confined spaces between machinery, everything is at close range. The Skitarii adapt their tactics to this environment, using their superior sensors and communications to coordinate movements and establish ambush positions. Vanguard units, their rad weapons making them lethal even in death, advance into the thick of the fighting, knowing their very presence contaminates the battlefield. Rangers establish overwatch positions on high structures, picking off Ork leaders and specialists whose loss might disrupt the enemy advance. Sicarian infiltrators wage a shadow war, emerging from hidden positions to eliminate isolated Ork mobs before vanishing back into the industrial labyrinth. But for every tactical success, there are setbacks. The Orks are learning the terrain as quickly as the defenders, their natural cunning allowing them to identify useful routes and strong positions. Mechs accompanying the invasion force begin setting up crude workshops, using scavenged materials to repair damaged vehicles and construct new weapons. Ork snipers, a contradiction in terms for most species, but surprisingly effective when deployed by the greenskins, begin targeting Skitarii from unexpected angles. The arrival of Ork vehicles transforms the battle. Trucks, crude transports that should not be able to move at the speeds they achieve, roar through the industrial landscape, carrying mobs of boys toward new objectives. Battle wagons, massive armored carriers bristling with weapons, smash through obstacles and blast defensive positions with devastating firepower. Death dreads, Ork walkers piloted by crazed greenskins, stride through the streets on hydraulic legs, their arms mounting a terrifying array of weapons. The Mechanicus responds with armor of their own. Scorpius Duneriders race to threatened positions, disgorging Skitarii reinforcements at critical moments. Onaga Dune Crawlers, their legs allowing them to traverse terrain that would stop conventional tanks, bring their heavy weapons to bear on Ork concentrations. Iron Strider engines hunt in packs, using their speed and agility to flank Ork positions and eliminate them with precise fire. These mechanized engagements fill the industrial landscape with fire and thunder. Las weapons hiss as they discharge, leaving afterimages on human retinas. Bolters roar, their mass-reactive shells detonating with wet crunches in Ork flesh. Plasma weapons shriek as they release sun-hot death. And above it all, the constant background noise of the Forge World's machinery continues, a reminder that even in the midst of war, production must continue. The Orks begin to consolidate their scattered landing sites, forming larger concentrations as nearby mobs link up. This process is chaotic and violent, with fights breaking out between different Ork clans over questions of precedence and loot rights. But gradually, a larger organizational structure emerges as the strongest Ork leaders assert dominance over their fellows. Supply lines, crude but functional, begin to form between landing sites and forward positions. Gretchens scurry through the battlefield carrying ammunition and supplies, while mechs establish repair depots where damaged vehicles can be patched back together. The Mechanicus observes this consolidation with growing concern. Scattered Ork mobs, while dangerous, can be defeated in detail, isolated, and destroyed before they can support each other. But as the greenskins form larger concentrations, they become exponentially more dangerous. The psychic field, generated by large numbers of Orks, makes their already impossible technology even more reliable, while simultaneously strengthening individual Orks and making them harder to kill. Critical facilities become focal points for particularly intense fighting. Power generation plants, which the Mechanicus desperately needs to keep online, and which the Orks want to either capture or destroy, see some of the bloodiest engagements. Water treatment facilities, essential for cooling the countless machines, turn into fortresses where Skitarii hold against wave after wave of greenskin assaults. And the sacred forges themselves, the heart of the Forge World's purpose, receive the strongest defenses, their approaches carpeted with Ork corpses. As the first day of ground combat draws to a close, the situation remains fluid. The Orks have established multiple beachheads and are steadily expanding their area of control. The Mechanicus has managed to contain most of these expansions, preventing the enemy from reaching truly critical facilities. Both sides have suffered casualties that would be considered catastrophic by most military forces. The Orks have lost tens of thousands, the Mechanicus thousands of Skitarii, and millions of menial workers pressed into militia service. But the real battle has not yet begun. The heaviest Ork forces are still landing, their leaders organizing for a major push. And the Mechanicus has not yet deployed its most powerful assets. In their cathedral homes, the Titans are awakening, and when they walk to war, the very nature of the conflict will change. The scattered skirmishes and confused melees of the first day are merely prologue. The true test of strength is about to begin. The walking gods, Titans, enter the war. The first warning the Orks have of what is coming is a tremor in the ground, rhythmic and steadily growing stronger. Those greenskins, with any experience in major warfare, recognize it immediately and let out bellows of excitement. The walking gods of the Mechanicus are on the move, and the real fight is about to begin. The deployment of a Titan is an event that transcends mere military necessity and becomes something approaching religious ceremony. As the god machines stride from their cathedral homes toward the battlefield, they are accompanied by processions of tech priests chanting in binary, by cohorts of Skitarii who will serve as their escorts, and by clouds of servitors performing final maintenance even as the Titans walk. To see a Warlord-class battle Titan in motion is to witness something that should not be possible. A war machine weighing thousands of tons moving with a grace that belies its massive size. For the princeps commanding these god machines, the experience of going to war is profoundly personal. Through their neural connection to the Titan systems, they feel the machine spirit's eagerness for battle, its barely controlled rage at the violation of the Forge world it has been built to protect. The connection is so deep that the princeps must constantly struggle to maintain their own identity, to avoid being subsumed entirely by the god machine's consciousness. This is the sacred burden they bear, to guide these engines of destruction while remaining sane enough to make tactical decisions. The initial deployment of Titans follows doctrine established over millennia of warfare. Warhound Scout Titans, the lightest and fastest of the god machines, advance first, using their superior speed and maneuverability to locate enemy concentrations and identify priority targets. Their role is not to engage in sustained combat, but to probe, to gather intelligence, and to disrupt enemy formations. At 15 to 17 meters tall and armed with weapons that can level buildings, they are by no means defenseless, but they know better than to try to hold ground against sustained assault. Behind the Warhounds come the Reavers, workhorses of the Titan legions. These battle Titans, standing over 22 meters tall, form the main battle line. Organized into maniples, groups of 2 to 5 Titans working in coordination, they advance with measured steps that eat up kilometers despite appearing slow. Their weapons, a terrifying array of laser blasters, plasma cannons, and Gatling guns, begin firing at maximum range, engaging Ork concentrations before the greenskins have any real chance to respond. The effect on the Ork forces is immediate and devastating. A single shot from a Titan's main armament can vaporize an entire mob of Ork boys, reducing dozens of greenskins to expanding clouds of superheated vapor. The secondary weapons, still more powerful than anything carried by standard vehicles, sweep through the battlefield like scythes through wheat. Void shields, energy barriers that protect the Titans from return fire, shimmer as they absorb incoming attacks, each impact creating a ripple of discharged energy but causing no actual damage. But the Orks are not without their own god machines. As the Mechanicus Titans advance, answering bellows echo from the Ork lines. Gargants, massive walking fortresses built by Ork mechs from scrap and salvage, begin their own ponderous advance. These crude constructions should not be able to move, let alone fight. But the Orks' collective belief makes them not just functional, but genuinely dangerous. A mega gargant can rival even a warlord Titan in size, and while its construction is crude, it compensates with sheer firepower and the fanatical enthusiasm of its crew. The first duel between Titan and Gargant becomes the centerpiece of the entire battle. A Reaver-class Titan, the Divine Flame, advances into an industrial district where a Mega Gargant has established itself, using a partially demolished manufactorum as cover. The engagement begins at a range of several kilometers, both god machines firing their longest-range weapons in attempts to score early damage. The Reaver's laser blaster punches through the Gargant's crude armor, destroying one of its many weapon mounts. The Gargant responds with a massive cannon that looks like it was ripped off a battleship, its shell impacting the Reaver's void shields with enough force to momentarily overload them. As the two Titans close, the intensity of fire increases. The Reaver's princeps, A veteran named Kalor Vex directs his weapons with centuries of experience, targeting weak points in the ball. Gargant structure. The Ork Gargant, commanded by a big mech whose name is simply Stompy, returns fire with every weapon that can be brought to bear, filling the air with shells, rockets, and crude energy blasts. The void shields collapse under this barrage, and for the first time, direct hits begin to damage the Reaver's armor. The Moderati, the Princeps' subordinates, who control the Titan's weapons and systems, call out damage reports in clipped, emotionless voices. Hull breach in the left leg, secondary cooling system offline, port weapons array damaged. But the Princeps does not waver, continuing the advance, knowing that at close range, the Reaver's superior construction will tell. The machine spirit of the divine flame is screaming for blood, its rage at being wounded fueling the Princeps' own fury. When the two god machines finally meet at point-blank range, the result is catastrophic for both. The Reaver's Power Fist, a massive close combat weapon powered by the Titans, reactor, punches through the Gargant's torso, ripping out crucial systems. The Gargant, in its death throes, unleashes everything it has, its weapons firing even as its structure begins to collapse. The Reaver staggers under this final assault, smoke pouring from a dozen wounds, but remains standing as the Gargant topples. This pattern repeats across the battlefield as more Titans and Gargants engage. Not all the duels favor the Mechanicus. A Warhound Scout Titan, the Swift Hunter, attempts to disable a Gargant's legs through precision strikes, but is caught in close combat when Ork boys swarm up its structure, planting crude explosives on vulnerable joints. The Titan falls, its reactor going critical in a blast that vaporizes everything within 100 meters. The deployment of heavier Titans escalates the conflict to an entirely new level of destruction. Warlord Battle Titans, massive war engines standing over 33 meters tall, stride into positions where their overwhelming firepower can be brought to bear. Each warlord is a mobile fortress, mounting weapons normally found on capital ships and protected by multiple layers of void shields. When they fire, the sound alone is enough to rupture eardrums at close range, and the destruction they unleash defies description. The Orks respond to this escalation with characteristic enthusiasm. More Gargants emerge from their landing sites, these ones even larger and more heavily armed than those engaged earlier. The ground shakes under their tread, and their weapons fill the sky with fire. Where a Gargant and a warlord meet, the resulting duel creates a zone of devastation so intense that nothing else can survive nearby. Buildings collapse from stray shots, the ground is cratered by missed ordnance, and the air itself becomes toxic from vaporized materials. Supporting these titanic duels are swarms of smaller units on both sides. Skitarii cohorts advance in the shadow of their Titans, securing ground and dealing, with Ork infantry that attempts to close with the god machines. Ork mobs, inspired by the presence of their own Gargants, launch mass charges that wash against Skitarii lines like waves against a cliff. The infantry battle, which might have been the focus of the entire war in other circumstances, becomes almost an afterthought, a sideshow to the clash of giants. The collateral damage from these Titan engagements is extraordinary. Every time a Titan fires its weapons, there is a chance of hitting something other than the intended target. Manufactorums are reduced to rubble by stray shots. Refineries explode when hit by plasma fire, creating firestorms that rage for hours. Critical infrastructure, some of it dating back thousands of years, is destroyed in seconds. The tech priests directing the Defense Watch with anguish as facilities they have maintained for lifetimes are annihilated, but they know there is no alternative. Better to destroy it fighting than lose it to the Orks. For the first time since the invasion began, the Orks start to face serious difficulties. The superiority of Mechanicus technology becomes impossible to ignore when embodied in a Titan. These god machines simply will not die easily. Where a Gargant might collapse after a lucky shot hits a critical system, a Titan's redundant systems and superior construction allow it to continue fighting even with severe damage. Void shields regenerate if given even brief respites. Damaged weapon systems can be rerouted through backup circuits. The machine spirits, ancient and cunning, guide self-repair systems to shore up failing structures. But the Orks have numbers on their side. For every Gargant destroyed, 2 more seem to appear. The Greenskins are manufacturing new war machines from salvaged materials even as the battle rages, their mechs working with manic intensity to create increasingly massive constructions. Some of these creations are so unstable they explode spontaneously, taking their crews with them. But others work, adding to the growing mass of Ork armor that the Titans must face. In the midst of this mechanized apocalypse, individual acts of heroism and tragedy unfold. A Reaver Titan, crippled and unable to move, makes a final stand against 3 Gargants, its crew choosing to fight to the death rather than abandon their god machine. A Warhound, its princeps killed by a lucky shot that penetrated the cockpit, continues to fight under the control of a Moderati who manages to maintain the neural link despite not having the training or augmentation for it. An Ork Gargant, its structure collapsing, crashes deliberately into a warlord, sacrificing itself to bring down the larger Titan. The Titan battle reaches its climax when the Forge World's most sacred war engine enters the fray. A warlord of the first founding, the Adamant Will, has walked since the Great Crusade. Its hull bears the scars of 10,000 years of warfare, and its machine spirit is ancient beyond measure. When it strides onto the battlefield, accompanied by a full maniple of supporting Titans, the Orks recognize the threat. The response is immediate and overwhelming. Every Gargant in the sector turns toward the Adamant Will, recognizing it as the greatest prize on the battlefield. The resulting multi-way duel involves nearly a dozen god machines on both sides, trading fire at ranges that devastate everything around them. The Adamant Will stands at the center of this storm, its weapons speaking with the voice of ancient fury, while its escorts attempt to protect it from the concentrated Ork assault. The duel lasts for hours, neither side willing to yield. Titans fall, their reactors exploding in miniature suns. Gargants collapse, their crude structures unable to withstand the precise fire of the Mechanicus war engines. The ground itself is transformed, the industrial landscape reduced to a wasteland of molten metal and burning wreckage. But when the firing finally ceases, the Adamant Will still stands, battered and wounded, but victorious, surrounded by the remains of the Gargants it has destroyed. This victory, bought at terrible cost, marks a turning point in the battle. The Orks have been stopped, at least temporarily, their advance halted by the wall of Titans. But the war is far from over. Both sides have committed their heavy assets and suffered grievous losses. The question now is which force can sustain this level of warfare longer, the methodical but resource-limited Mechanicus, or the crude but numberless Orks. The Forge's heart, fighting for critical infrastructure. As the Titan battle rages in the industrial sectors, a parallel conflict unfolds in the depths of the Forge World's most critical facilities. These locations, the reactor complexes that power the planet, the sacred forges where the most precious artifacts are created, and the data vaults containing irreplaceable knowledge, become the targets of specialized Ork assault forces. The Mechanicus, fully aware of what losing these facilities would mean, defends them with fanatical determination. The primary reactor complex, a massive facility generating the immense power needed to run a planetary forge, becomes the site of some of the bloodiest fighting. The Orks understand, in their crude way, that destroying or capturing this facility would cripple the Forge World's defenses. A massive assault, led by a war boss known as Graka Ironteeth, throws everything at the reactor's outer defenses, wave after wave of boys supported by battle wagons and deaf dreads. The defenders know that any damage to the reactor itself could trigger a catastrophic failure that would devastate half the continent. They cannot use their heaviest weapons, cannot risk stray shots penetrating the reactor shielding. Instead, they must rely on precise fire and defensive positions that channel the Ork assault into killing zones. Skitarii Rangers, positioned on the upper levels of the complex, engage Orks at maximum range, each shot carefully placed to avoid hitting critical systems. Vanguard units hold the lower approaches, their rad weapons turning the narrow access corridors into death traps. The fighting here is claustrophobic and brutal. The Orks cannot bring their numbers to bear in the confined spaces, but neither can the Skitarii use their superior firepower effectively. Combat resolves into desperate melees in corridors barely wide enough for two combatants to stand side by side. Skitarii combat protocols guide their movements in these tight quarters, identifying optimal strike points and defensive postures. But against Orks, who simply charge straight ahead without any regard for their own safety, precision becomes less important than determination. Tech priests, normally relegated to command roles or sacred duties, find themselves forced into direct combat. Some wield weapons designed for ceremony rather than warfare, ancient plasma pistols or power axes that have not seen use in centuries. Others activate combat protocols in their servitor attendants, turning what were maintenance units into crude but effective combat servitors. The result is a bizarre sight. Robed figures surrounded by cybernetic constructs, holding defensive positions against waves of howling greenskins. In one sector of the reactor complex, a particularly intense engagement develops around the primary coolant pumping station. If the Orks damage this facility, the reactor will overheat and shut down automatically, crippling the Forge World's power supply. A Skitarii force under the command of an Alpha designated Theta 77 establishes a defensive perimeter, using the massive coolant pipes as cover and creating interlocking fields of fire. The Orks assault this position repeatedly, losing dozens of boys with each attempt, but slowly wearing down the defenders. Theta 77, his emotional centers long since removed, but his tactical processors still fully functional, calculates that his force cannot hold indefinitely. He makes the decision that defines the entire engagement. Rather than wait for the Orks to overwhelm his position, he orders a counterattack. The Skitarii, their targeting systems linked through binary communication, execute the assault with mechanical precision. They advance in a perfectly coordinated line, each warrior moving to support his fellows, their fire so coordinated it sounds like a single sustained burst. The Orks, surprised by this sudden aggression, falter for the first time. The Skitarii push them back, meter by meter, until the coolant station is secured. Theta 77 himself falls in this action, a crude Ork chopper finally ending his centuries of service, but his objective is achieved. Similar scenes play out across the Forge world as other critical facilities come under attack. The atmospheric processing plants, which maintain the toxic but breathable air that Forge world inhabitants depend on, see running battles between Ork, Storm Boys, Greenskins, equipped with crude jump packs, and Skitarii Iron Strider engines that patrol the tall structures. The water treatment facilities become fortresses, their defenders dumping contaminated water on approaching Orks and using the terrain to their advantage. But nowhere is the fighting more intense than in the sacred forges themselves. These are not merely production facilities, but temples to the machine god, places where the most precious and complex technologies are created. Some forges date back to the dark age of technology, containing equipment whose function is only partially understood, but whose value is incalculable. To lose these forges would be to lose irreplaceable knowledge, to take a step further down the path of technological decline that has plagued humanity for millennia. The Mechanicus defends these sacred spaces with everything they have. Each forge becomes a fortress, its approaches mined and trapped, its corridors filled with automated defenses and patrolled by elite Skitarii. Tech priests who have dedicated their entire existence to the maintenance of these facilities refuse to evacuate, instead taking up arms to defend their life's work. Some even activate ancient defensive systems that have lain dormant for centuries, weapons of such power that they destroy attacker and defender alike. The Orks attack these forges with particular enthusiasm. The mechs leading these assaults understand, perhaps better than even their war bosses, the value of what lies within. Advanced technology, ancient manufacturing equipment, and stockpiles of rare materials all represent potential loot beyond the wildest dreams of most Orks. The thought of capturing a sacred forge drives them to attempts at coordination that would be impressive in any force, let alone greenskins. In the Forge of the Divine Cog, one of the oldest and most sacred facilities on the planet, the battle reaches an almost mythic intensity. The forge's defenders, led by an ancient tech priest named Archmagos Vaal, have transformed the facility into a maze of death. Every corridor is trapped, every approach covered by overlapping fire, and the forge's own machinery has been weaponized. Massive presses and cutting lasers turned into improvised defensive weapons. The Orks assault this fortress for 3 days straight, their bodies literally piling up in the narrow approaches. But they keep coming, driven by the promise of loot and the sheer challenge of the fight. Warboss Skargrim Teethbreaker leads from the front, his massive power claw smashing through barricades, and his bellowing voice driving his boys forward, even when all rational creatures would have retreated. The tide finally turns, when Skargrim discovers a forgotten maintenance shaft that allows his forces to bypass the main defenses. Ork commandos, specialists in sneaky tactics by Ork standards, infiltrate through this route and emerge inside the forge proper. The defenders, caught between the frontal assault and this unexpected attack from behind, begin to fall back toward the forge's innermost sanctum. Archmagos Vaal, calculating that the forge cannot be held, makes a decision that will haunt the Mechanicus for generations. Rather than allow the sacred machinery to fall into Ork hands, he initiates the facility's self-destruct protocols. Ancient systems, installed for exactly this contingency, begin a countdown that will vaporize everything within a kilometer. Vaal remains at his post, continuing to coordinate the defense, even as he knows death is approaching. The explosion, when it comes, is visible from orbit. The Forge of the Divine Cog and everything around it simply ceases to exist, replaced by a crater that glows with residual heat. Thousands of Orks die in the blast, including Warboss Skargrim. But so too does irreplaceable knowledge, machinery that cannot be rebuilt, and the accumulated work of millennia. The Mechanicus has saved the forge from capture, but at the cost of destroying it themselves. This pattern repeats across the forge world as defenders are forced to make impossible choices. Some facilities are saved through heroic defense. Others fall to the Orks, who immediately begin looting them. Still others are destroyed by their own defenders rather than surrendered. The forge world is being slowly dismembered, its industrial capacity degraded with each hour of fighting. The psychological impact on the Mechanicus forces is profound. For beings who define themselves through their devotion to the machine god, watching sacred machinery destroyed or captured represents a spiritual wound as much as a tactical defeat. Some tech priests, unable to bear the loss, actually shut down, their augmented minds unable to process the contradiction between their duty to preserve technology and the necessity of destroying it. Others become increasingly fanatical, throwing themselves into the fighting with a desperation born of loss. But the Orks, too, are suffering. The casualties they have taken in these assaults on fortified positions are enormous, even by their standards. Entire mobs have been wiped out, their boys ground down in brutal attritional fighting. The easy victories of the initial landing are long past. Now they face prepared defenders fighting for ground they know intimately, and the cost is beginning to tell, even on creatures as enthusiastic about warfare as the greenskins. The question facing both sides is simple. Can the Mechanicus hold enough critical infrastructure to maintain their defensive capability, or will the Orks destroy or capture so much that the forge world becomes untenable? As the fighting enters its second week, with no end in sight, that question remains unanswered. But what is clear is that neither side is willing to give up, and the Forge world will burn before either accepts defeat. The adaptive battlefield, looting, learning, and escalation. One of the most disturbing aspects of an Orc invasion, from the Mechanicus perspective, is the speed at which the Greenskins adapt to their environment and incorporate captured technology into their own arsenal. What begins as a conflict between crude Orc weaponry and sophisticated Mechanicus systems slowly transforms as the battle progresses, with the Orcs becoming more dangerous with each passing day. The looting begins almost immediately after the first Orc victories. Any piece of Mechanicus equipment that is not completely destroyed becomes fair game. Damaged Skitarii walkers are dragged back to Orc lines, where mechs immediately begin tearing them apart to understand their construction. Captured weapons are examined with surprising care, their mechanisms studied and replicated in crude but functional copies. Even destroyed Titans attract attention, with mechs swarming over the wreckage looking for salvageable components. This scavenging takes on an almost ritualistic quality. Orc mechs treat captured Mechanicus technology with something approaching reverence, not because they understand its sacred nature, but because they recognize quality craftsmanship when they see it. A mech who successfully incorporates a Mechanicus plasma coil into an Orc weapon becomes a celebrity among his kind, his reputation enhanced by his ability to make the loot work proper. The results of this looting are both impressive and terrifying. Orc battle wagons begin appearing with weapons clearly salvaged from destroyed Scorpius tanks, their original precision mechanisms replaced with crude but effective Orc modifications. Gargants start mounting Mechanicus weapons alongside their own crude armaments, creating hybrid systems that should not function but somehow do. Even individual Orc boys are seen carrying galvanic rifles, the Skitarii's preferred weapons, though how they keep them functioning without proper maintenance is a mystery. But the adaptation goes beyond simple looting. The Orcs begin to learn the Forge world's layout, identifying shortcuts and hidden routes through the industrial landscape. They discover weak points in defensive positions, exploiting them with a cunning that belies their brutish appearance. The Commandos, Orc specialists in sneaky tactics, become particularly adept at this, conducting raids that penetrate deep into Mechanicus-held territory before vanishing back into the labyrinth of industry. The Mechanicus, for their part, is also adapting, though in characteristically methodical fashion. Tech priests analyze captured Orc technology, trying to understand the psychic component that allows it to function. The results are inconclusive but troubling. Orc weapons do seem to work better when surrounded by other Orcs, and completely cease functioning when the last greenskin is eliminated. This suggests that the psychic field is real and measurable, which raises disturbing questions about the nature of reality itself. Tactical doctrine is adjusted based on observed Orc behavior. The Mechanicus begins deploying more anti-armor weapons, recognizing that the Orcs are fielding an increasing number of heavily armored vehicles. Titan maniples adjust their formations to account for the threat of mass Gargant assaults. And critically, the Mechanicus begins targeting Orc mechs as high-priority targets, understanding that eliminating these specialists significantly degrades the enemy's ability to maintain their equipment. The battlefield itself becomes increasingly nightmarish as the fighting continues. Vast swaths of the Forge world are reduced to rubble, the once ordered industrial landscape transformed into a chaotic wasteland of burning wreckage and cratered ground. The air grows thick with smoke and toxic fumes, making breathing difficult even for augmented Skitarii. Water supplies become contaminated with chemical runoff from destroyed refineries, forcing both sides to compete for access to remaining clean sources. The spore problem begins to manifest in earnest. Everywhere, Orcs have died, which is to say nearly everywhere on the planet, spores have been released. In the ruins of destroyed manufactorums, in the depths of damaged mine workings, in the shadows of still functioning facilities, these microscopic organisms begin to grow. Within weeks of the initial invasion, reports start coming in of feral orc tribes emerging from areas that were cleared days earlier, forcing the Mechanicus to divert resources to deal with infestations in their rear areas. This creates a strategic nightmare for the defenders. Not only must they fight the main orc force, but they now face an insurgency throughout their entire territory. Skitarii patrols find themselves ambushed by primitive orcs wielding crude stone weapons. Convoys attempting to move supplies between defended zones come under attack from greenskins who should not even exist yet. The Forge world is becoming infested, contaminated at a fundamental level by the very presence of the orc invaders. The orcs, recognizing this development, deliberately spread their forces as widely as possible. Even when it would be tactically sound to concentrate their strength, they instead maintain a dispersed presence, knowing that each orc who dies releases spores that will create future problems for the defenders. It is a strategy that only works for a species that reproduces through spores, and it is devastatingly effective. As the battle enters its third week, both sides begin to show signs of strain. The orc momentum, unstoppable in the early days, has been blunted by the sheer toughness of the Mechanicus defense. They control perhaps a third of the Forge world's surface, but their attempts to push deeper are meeting increasingly stiff resistance. Supply becomes a concern even for orcs, who normally scavenge everything they need. The Forge world's toxic environment makes foraging difficult, and the defenders have destroyed many potential sources of loot. The Mechanicus, for their part, is running low on critical resources. Ammunition expenditure has been enormous, outstripping even pessimistic projections. Skitarii casualties, while lower than orc losses in absolute numbers, represent a larger percentage of total strength and cannot be easily replaced. Most critically, several Titan losses have created gaps in the defensive line that cannot be filled. The remaining god machines are showing signs of wear, their machine spirits growing temperamental from constant combat without proper maintenance. Reinforcements remain the great unknown for both sides. The Mechanicus's desperate pleas for aid have been sent across multiple star systems, but responses are slow in coming. Other Forge worlds, dealing with their own crises in a galaxy at war, can spare little. Space Marine chapters, stretched thin across the Imperium, can send only token forces, if anything. The Navy, engaged in critical void battles across the sector, cannot guarantee when a relief fleet might arrive. The Orks face a different problem. Their reinforcements keep arriving in the form of orc warbands that hear about the big fight and want to join in. But these newcomers often fight with the established orc forces over questions of who is in charge and who gets the best loot. Warboss Graka Ironteeth has had to spend as much time asserting dominance over rival bosses as he has fighting the Mechanicus. Several times, internecine orc conflicts have actually benefited the defenders, creating lulls in the assault as the greenskins sort out their internal disputes. The psychological warfare, such as it is, takes on interesting characteristics. The orcs begin painting captured Mechanicus symbols on their vehicles, not understanding their significance, but recognizing them as lucky. This has the effect of confusing Skitarii targeting systems, which sometimes identify these vehicles as friendly for critical seconds before correction. The Mechanicus responds by painting false targets, servitors modified to resemble valuable equipment which the orcs waste time and effort capturing only to discover their prize is worthless. Acts of individual heroism and horror continue to accumulate. A single Skitarii ranger, callsign Gamma 12, holds a critical choke point for 6 hours against repeated orc assaults, his galvanic rifle speaking with mechanical precision until his ammunition is exhausted and he is finally overrun. An orc mech named Gubzag manages to construct a crude teleporter, which promptly explodes, taking half his workshop and dozens of boys with it. A tech priest achieves communion with the machine spirit of a damaged Titan, guiding self-repair processes that restore it to functionality against all predictions. The battle has become a war of attrition, the kind of grinding, brutal conflict that the Imperium is all too familiar with. Victory will go not to the side with better tactics or superior technology, but to whichever force can endure longer. And as both the Mechanicus and the Orks dig in for what could be a prolonged siege, the question of endurance becomes paramount. Can the defenders hold out until reinforcements arrive? Can the Orks maintain their assault in the face of mounting casualties? The answer to these questions will determine the fate of the Forge world and, potentially, the entire sector. Endgame. Scenarios of victory, defeat, and stalemate. As the battle for the Forge world enters its decisive phase, several potential outcomes begin to emerge, each with profound implications for both the immediate combatants and the wider Imperium. The nature of this conflict, pitting the technological might of the Mechanicus against the endless tide of the Greenskins, creates unique possibilities for how it might resolve. The best-case scenario for the Mechanicus involves the arrival of substantial reinforcements at a critical moment. Picture this. The defenders, bloodied and exhausted, are holding a shrinking perimeter around the Forge world's most critical facilities. Ork forces have penetrated deep into formerly secure areas, and the fall of the planet seems inevitable. Then, without warning, the system's edge erupts with warp signatures. Not Ork ships this time, but Imperial vessels, a Space Marine strike force drawn from a nearby chapter, accompanied by Navy escorts and carrying guard regiments. The relief force, though outnumbered by the Ork fleet, has the advantage of surprise and superior coordination. They punch through the disorganized Ork blockade and begin landing troops at strategic points across the Forge world. The Space Marines, warriors whose mere presence can turn the tide of battle, immediately engage the largest Ork concentrations. The guard regiments reinforce defensive positions, while Navy air support begins the systematic destruction of Ork supply lines. For the Orks, this sudden reversal is confusing, but also exciting. Now there are even more enemies to fight, including the legendary Space Marines. Some Ork forces actually turn away from the Mechanicus to engage this new threat, drawn by the promise of a proper scrap with such renowned opponents. This splitting of focus is exactly what the defenders need. The Mechanicus, sensing the shift in momentum, launches counterattacks at points where the Ork presence has thinned. The subsequent fighting is no less brutal than what came before, but now it has direction and purpose beyond mere survival. The combined Imperial forces begin systematically clearing the Forge world, sector by sector. Ork strongpoints that had resisted for weeks fall to combined arms assaults. The green tide, which had seemed unstoppable, begins to recede. Within months, organized Ork resistance is broken, though scattered warbands and emerging spore tribes will plague the Forge world for years to come. This victory, however, comes at tremendous cost. Large portions of the Forge world lie in ruins, their industrial capacity destroyed. Irreplaceable knowledge has been lost. The population has been decimated. Worst of all, the spore infestation means the planet will never truly be free of the Ork threat. The Mechanicus faces the choice of accepting a permanent security burden or ordering an exterminatus on their own world, destroying everything to prevent the Ork contamination from spreading. Now consider the nightmare scenario. The Orks win. This does not happen through a single climactic battle, but rather through the slow grinding down of the defenders. Week by week, the Mechanicus perimeter shrinks. Each counterattack is weaker than the last. Skitarii forces, irreplaceable in the short term, dwindle to nothing. Titans fall one by one, their ancient machine spirits finally silenced. The tech priests watch helplessly as their world dies around them. The final collapse might come suddenly. A critical reactor facility falls, cutting power to entire defensive sectors. The remaining Titans, unable to recharge their void shields, are swarmed and destroyed. Or perhaps it happens slowly, a gradual loss of territory until the defenders control nothing but a single manufactorum complex, holding out against a green tide that completely surrounds them. If the Mechanicus leadership has time and means, they attempt evacuation. The most critical tech priests, carrying copies of essential data, flee aboard the few remaining spacecraft. They leave behind billions of inhabitants who cannot be saved, along with technology and knowledge that will be lost forever. As they escape into the warp, they look back at their dying world, knowing they will spend the rest of their lives trying to rebuild what was lost in a few short weeks. For the Orks, this is the greatest victory imaginable. An entire Forge world, with all its technology and infrastructure, now belongs to them. What they do with this prize varies depending on the surviving war boss. Some might attempt to maintain production, ordering their mechs to figure out how to run the captured facilities. The results are predictably disastrous, with most machinery either breaking down or being modified into something completely different. Others simply loot everything of value and move on, leaving the Forge world a gutted shell. The environmental damage from the battle, combined with the complete breakdown of maintenance, transforms the planet into a toxic wasteland. Within decades, it becomes uninhabitable even by Ork standards, a dead world orbiting its star as a monument to the cost of failure. But perhaps the most likely outcome is neither clear victory nor decisive defeat, but rather a grinding stalemate that could last for years. Both sides dig in, establishing fortified positions that neither can easily dislodge. The Mechanicus holds the core industrial facilities, maintaining minimal production capacity. The Orks control the outskirts and rural areas, using captured equipment to sustain their force. In this scenario, the Forge world becomes a permanent battleground, with territory changing hands regularly, but neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage. Small-scale engagements occur daily, ranging from Skitarii patrols clashing with Ork mobs to larger battles over specific facilities. The toll on both sides is steady and sustainable, which paradoxically ensures the war continues. This stalemate transforms the nature of the Forge world entirely. Production shifts entirely to war material needed for local defense. The civilian population, those who survive the initial fighting, becomes militarized, with every able body pressed into some form of service. Children are born into a world at war, knowing nothing but the sound of distant combat and the smell of smoke on the wind. For the Orks, this is actually ideal. They have found a world where they can fight constantly without running out of enemies. New Orks, emerging from spores, immediately join the fight, their genetic memories guiding them to the sound of battle. The conflict becomes self-sustaining, a permanent war that neither side can win, but neither will abandon. The psychological impact of these different outcomes varies dramatically. In the victory scenario, the Mechanicus faces the bitter knowledge that survival came at enormous cost. They saved their Forge world, but destroyed much of what made it valuable in the process. The years and centuries of rebuilding will be spent knowing that another attack could come at any time, and next time, reinforcements might not arrive. In the defeat scenario, for those tech priests who survive, the loss is almost incomprehensible. They failed in their most sacred duty, the protection and preservation of the machine god's works. Some might find purpose in planning eventual reconquest, dedicating their remaining existence to building the forces necessary to retake what was lost. Others might simply shut down, their augmented minds unable to process such complete failure. The stalemate scenario creates its own unique horror, the knowledge that this is now normal, that war is not a temporary state, but a permanent condition. Tech priests who remember peace become increasingly rare, their warnings about the old ways dismissed by those who know only conflict. The Forge world's culture shifts, becoming more militant, more fatalistic, shaped by generations of endless war. For the wider Imperium, the outcome of this battle has ripple effects that extend across sectors. A victorious defense, even at great cost, sends a message that Forge Worlds can be held against major Ork invasions. This might embolden other defensive preparations or lead to overconfidence. A defeat creates a strategic gap in production capacity that affects military operations across multiple star systems. And a stalemate ties up resources that could be used elsewhere, becoming a constant drain on Imperial logistics. The Orks, regardless of outcome, have achieved something significant simply by launching such a major assault. Other war bosses hear about it and are inspired to attempt similar raids. The success of even a partial victory encourages more greenskin invasions of industrial worlds, creating a cascade effect that the Imperium struggles to contain. And lurking beneath all these scenarios is the spore problem. Win or lose, fight or flee, the Orks have contaminated the Forge world with their presence. Those microscopic spores, settling into every crack and crevice, represent a permanent change to the planet's ecosystem. Future generations will fight battles against feral Orks emerging from forgotten depths, a legacy of this invasion that might last longer than any of the grand strategies or heroic stands. Long-term consequences. The aftermath of apocalypse. The immediate fighting might end, whether in victory, defeat, or exhausted stalemate, but the consequences of an Ork invasion of a Forge world extend far beyond the battlefield. The scars left by such a conflict are deep, affecting not just the physical landscape, but the economic, strategic, and even spiritual fabric of the Imperium in that region. The most obvious and immediate consequence is the sheer physical devastation. A Forge world that has endured weeks or months of warfare between Titans and Gargants, between massed Skitarii formations and Ork hordes, does not simply bounce back. Entire industrial districts have been reduced to rubble. Critical infrastructure, some of it irreplaceable, has been destroyed. The carefully maintained balance of systems that allowed the planet to function as a single massive factory has been shattered. Reconstruction, even with the Mechanicus's technical expertise, takes decades at minimum. Some facilities cannot be rebuilt at all, their specialized equipment destroyed, and the knowledge of their construction lost, with the tech priests who maintained them. The Forge world's production capacity, which might have supplied dozens of nearby sectors, drops precipitously. This creates immediate crises across the map. Imperium, as military forces that depended on this Forge world's output, find themselves short of critical supplies. The economic ripple effects extend far beyond simple supply shortages. Other Forge worlds, sensing opportunity, might attempt to claim the contracts and obligations previously fulfilled by the damaged planet. This leads to political maneuvering within the Mechanicus hierarchy, with different factions competing for the right to replace the fallen production capacity. Some see this as a chance for advancement, while others view it as a sacred duty to preserve the damaged Forge world's rightful place in the Mechanicus order. The spore infestation creates a perpetual security burden. Every shadowy corner, every forgotten sublevel, every sealed section of damaged infrastructure becomes a potential breeding ground for new Ork generations. The Mechanicus must maintain constant patrols, dedicating resources to an endless war of extermination against feral Orks that emerge from the depths. This is not glorious warfare against organized foes, but rather a grinding guerrilla conflict against primitives armed with crude weapons, but possessing all the resilience and aggression of their species. These feral Orks become an environmental hazard in their own right. Work crews sent to clear rubble or salvage equipment find themselves ambushed by greenskins who should not exist. Maintenance personnel venturing into remote areas vanish, their deaths attributed to Ork attack, but their bodies never recovered. The psychological impact on the workforce is significant, as fear becomes a constant companion in areas that were once safe. The Mechanicus attempts various solutions to this problem. Specialized hunter-killer teams of Skitarii are formed, dedicated entirely to purging Ork infestations. Tech priests develop new weapons and tactics specifically designed for fighting in the ruins. Some even advocate for systematic destruction of contaminated areas, essentially condemning entire sectors of the Forge world to prevent them from becoming Ork breeding grounds. But all these solutions are stopgap measures. The only way to truly eliminate the Ork threat would be exterminatus, and the Mechanicus will not easily destroy their own world. The strategic implications of the battle extend across entire subsectors. If the Forge world successfully defended itself, it becomes a symbol of resistance, proof that Ork invasions can be stopped. This has both positive and negative effects. It inspires other defenders and demonstrates that even overwhelming greenskin numbers can be defeated with proper preparation and determination. But it also attracts attention from Ork war bosses, who see the Forge world as a worthy challenge, increasing the likelihood of future attacks. If the Forge world fell, the strategic consequences are even more severe. A major industrial planet in Ork hands, even if they cannot effectively utilize its facilities, represents a gap in the Imperium's defensive network. Neighboring systems must increase their own defenses, diverting resources from other priorities. The loss of production capacity forces military forces across entire sectors to adjust their operational planning, sometimes leading to defensive withdrawals or abandoned campaigns. The knowledge lost in such conflicts cannot be quantified, but is perhaps the most tragic consequence. Every destroyed data vault potentially contains information that exists nowhere else in the galaxy. Tech priests killed in the fighting take with them centuries or millennia of accumulated expertise. Ancient machines destroyed in the battle might be the last of their kind, their construction methods lost to time. For a civilization that has spent 10,000 years gradually losing technological capability, each such loss represents another step toward ultimate decline. The Mechanicus attempts to preserve what knowledge they can. Before retreating from doomed positions, tech priests desperately copy data to portable storage devices. Sacred texts are evacuated before manufactorums fall, but in the chaos of battle, much is inevitably lost. The survivors spend years trying to reconstruct what was destroyed, interviewing surviving tech priests, analyzing fragments of recovered data, attempting to piece together the lost knowledge like archaeologists studying ancient ruins. The cultural impact within the Mechanicus itself is profound. A Forge world is not merely a factory, but a community with its own traditions, its own interpretation of the Mechanicus creed, its own relationship with the machine god. When that community is destroyed or permanently altered, something unique and irreplaceable is lost. Surviving tech priests might attempt to preserve their world's traditions, but without the physical environment and daily practices that gave those traditions meaning, they inevitably fade. For the wider Imperium, the battle serves as a reminder of both human resilience and vulnerability. The fact that a Forge world can be successfully invaded by Orks, despite all its defenses and technological advantages, demonstrates that nowhere in the galaxy is truly safe. This knowledge has different effects on different populations. Some respond with increased militarization and preparation. Others fall into fatalism, accepting that the Imperium's slow decline is inevitable. The Space Marine chapters that participated in the relief or defense, if any did, carry away their own lessons. They observe how the Mechanicus fights, noting both strengths and weaknesses. These observations inform their own tactical doctrines and might influence how they request Mechanicus support in future campaigns. The relationships formed in battle, whether positive or strained, can last for centuries and affect future cooperation between these institutions. The environmental transformation of the Forge world itself is perhaps the most visible long-term consequence. A planet that was already heavily industrialized and environmentally compromised before the invasion becomes even more toxic. Chemical contamination from destroyed refineries seeps into groundwater. Radiation from damaged reactors creates permanent dead zones. The very air becomes more poisonous, forcing even augmented inhabitants to wear rebreathers in areas that were once breathable. This environmental damage creates a vicious cycle. Cleanup efforts require resources and manpower that could be used for reconstruction. But without cleanup, the environment continues to degrade, making reconstruction more difficult. Some tech priests argue for accepting the new baseline, adapting to the worst conditions rather than trying to restore what was lost. Others insist that restoration is a sacred duty, part of honoring the machine god through proper maintenance of his works. The political ramifications extend to the highest levels of both the Mechanicus and the Imperium. Questions are asked about how the invasion was allowed to occur. Were the defenses inadequate? Should warning signs have been heeded sooner? Could reinforcements have arrived faster? These questions, often asked in bad faith by those seeking advantage, nonetheless lead to genuine reforms in some cases. Defense protocols are updated. Communication networks are strengthened. Supply stockpiles are increased. But these reforms come too late for the Forge world that has already suffered. They are, at best, insurance against future catastrophes. And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where threats arise from 1,000 directions and resources are always scarce, even the best reforms provide only marginal improvements in security. The survivors of the battle, both Mechanicus and any Imperial forces that participated, carry their own burdens. Skitarii who fought might receive commemorative modifications, additional augmentations that mark them as veterans of the defense. Tech priests who survived when colleagues died might question the randomness of survival, their usually logical minds struggling with the emotional weight of loss. Space Marines, if involved, add the battle to their chapter's honors, but also to their tally of worlds that could not be fully saved. As years turn to decades turn to centuries, the battle becomes part of the Forge world's history, a defining moment that separates the time before from the time after. Veterans of the fighting grow old and die, even with augmentation extending their lifespans. New generations rise who know the war only through stories and historical records. But the scars remain, in the rebuilt but never quite the same facilities, in the eternal vigilance against orc infestations, in the knowledge that it could happen again. And that knowledge, that awareness of vulnerability, might be the truest long-term consequence of all. The Forge world that survives an orc invasion is changed fundamentally, its priorities shifted towards security and defense in ways that affect every aspect of its culture and operations. It becomes, in a sense, a fortress first and a forge second, its identity reshaped by the trauma of near destruction. The galaxy, uncaring and infinite in its indifference, continues to turn. Other crises arise. Other wars are fought. The orc invasion of this particular Forge world becomes one entry among billions in the Imperium's endless record of conflict. But for those who lived through it, for those who fought and survived or died, for those who lost what cannot be replaced, it remains the central event of their existence, the moment that defines all that came before and all that follows. Conclusion: the eternal struggle. As we step back from the specific details of orc invasions of Forge worlds and consider the larger implications, certain truths emerge about the nature of warfare in the 41st millennium. The conflict between the Mechanicus and the Greenskins is not merely one engagement among many, but rather a microcosm of the Imperium's eternal struggle for survival against forces that should not exist, but nonetheless threaten to overwhelm humanity at every turn. The Orks represent something fundamentally antithetical to everything the Mechanicus believes. Where the tech priests see the universe as a machine operating according to comprehensible laws, the Orks embody chaos and irrationality. Their technology works because they believe it will, mocking the careful research and devotion that goes into every Mechanicus creation. Their numbers seem endless, reproducing through spores in a way that makes complete victory impossible. They fight not from necessity or strategy, but from sheer joy in combat an alien psychology that defies analysis. Yet despite all their advantages, the Orks do not always win. The Mechanicus, armed with superior technology, precise tactics, and the unshakable determination of those who fight to protect sacred trusts, can and does successfully defend Forge Worlds. The price is always high, measured in lives lost, knowledge destroyed, and infrastructure damaged beyond repair. But the alternative, surrender to the green tide, is unthinkable. And so the fight continues. Every battle a testament to the Imperium's refusal to accept defeat even in the face of impossible odds. These conflicts also remind us that in the grim darkness of the far future, there are no clean victories. The Mechanicus might drive off an Ork invasion, but the spore contamination remains. They might preserve their Forge World's industrial capacity, but at the cost of destroying irreplaceable ancient facilities. They might maintain production, but knowing that another attack could come at any moment, forcing them to divert resources to defense rather than creation. For those of us who study these events, whether as chroniclers, strategists, or simply those who seek to understand the forces that shape our galaxy, the Ork invasions of Forge Worlds offer valuable lessons. They demonstrate the importance of preparation, showing how the Mechanicus's millennia of defensive planning allows them to resist even overwhelming force. They highlight the value of flexibility, as rigid adherence to doctrine often fails against an enemy that operates outside all normal parameters. And they remind us that sometimes survival itself is the only victory achievable. The stories of individual heroism and sacrifice that emerge from these battles deserve their own remembrance. The Skitarii, who holds his position against impossible odds, buying time for evacuation. The tech priest, who destroys her life's work rather than see it captured. The princeps, who guides a crippled titan to one final victory before the machine spirit finally falls silent. These are not merely tactical decisions, but acts of profound devotion, demonstrations of the human spirit's refusal to yield, even when transformed into something more than human. And we must not forget the civilians, those billions of menial workers who never asked for war but found themselves caught in its grip. Their stories are less glorious, but no less important. The factory worker who takes up arms for the first time in defense of the only home they have known. The families separated by the chaos of battle. The children who grow up knowing nothing but the sound of distant combat. Their sacrifice, though less celebrated, is no less real. As you contemplate what we have explored together, consider the broader implications for your understanding of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The Ork invasions of Forge Worlds are not isolated incidents, but part of an endless cycle of conflict that defines this age. Everywhere the Imperium looks, it faces existential threats. The forces of chaos seek to corrupt and destroy. Tyrannid hive fleets devour entire sectors. Necron dynasties awaken from eons of slumber. And always, the Orks, fighting simply because fighting is what they do. In this context, the defense of Forge Worlds takes on additional significance. They are not merely industrial centers, but symbols of humanity's refusal to slide into oblivion. Every successful defense is a declaration that the Imperium endures. Every facility saved is a piece of humanity's legacy preserved. Every Ork invasion repelled is a victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. But we must also acknowledge the cost of this defiance. The Imperium is slowly losing ground, its territory shrinking, its resources depleting, its knowledge fading. Each battle, even those won, drains strength that cannot easily be replenished. The Mechanicus creates technology it does not fully understand, performing rituals that were once understood science. The loss of even one Forge World accelerates this decline, taking with it knowledge and capability that may never be recovered. Yet, in the face of all this, humanity fights on. Not because victory is assured, but because surrender is unthinkable. The Mechanicus defends its Forge Worlds not just for strategic reasons, but from a deep-seated belief in the sanctity of the machine god's works. The Skitarii march to war, not from hope of reward, but from programmed duty. The tech priests sacrifice ancient technology not callously, but from the terrible necessity of preventing worse losses. And so the cycle continues. Orks invade, the Mechanicus defends, battles are fought, won and lost. Forge worlds survive or fall. Knowledge is preserved or lost. And the galaxy, uncaring and infinite, continues to turn, heedless of the tiny struggles of organic and mechanical beings, fighting for survival on worlds that are themselves specks of dust in the cosmic vastness. If you found value in this exploration of orc invasions of Forge worlds, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These deep dives into the lore and mechanics of Warhammer 40,000 take considerable research and effort to produce, and your support makes them possible. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this topic, or suggesting what aspect of the 40K universe you would like to see explored next. Together, we can continue to illuminate the grim darkness of the far future, one detailed analysis at a time. Until next time, remember, in the eternal war that defines the 41st millennium, knowledge is the greatest weapon, vigilance the truest shield, and dedication to the machine, God the only path to salvation. The Forge worlds will endure. They must endure. For if they fall, so too does humanity's last hope of survival in a galaxy that wants nothing more than to see it destroyed.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.